Hi, I'm Ondřej Trhoň, and you are listening to the Research with Art podcast, where I try to answer the question, what does it mean to do artistic research today? Welcome to the second part. Since newly founded LARCH, the Laboratory for Art, Research and Graduate Education at the Academy of Fine Arts Prague just got its director, it felt natural to talk to her. So, in December 2023, I Zoom called with Irina Gheorghe, an artist who works primarily with performance in combination with installation, drawing, photography or video. We talked not only about her own research-based practice, kick-started by an interest in philosophy and unobservable phenomena, but about artistic research in general. What is the relationship between artistic research and other disciplines? What separates art that works with theory or research practices from artistic research? And what vision Irina wants to bring to the Academy and LARCH? If I'd ask you to use some hashtags to describe artistic research as you understand it, what would those hashtags be? And maybe how are they related to the approach you're about to bring to the Academy of Fine Arts?
That's a difficult question because you have to bring what I think are quite contradictory situations into very short words. So of course you can think of things like the relationship between art and knowledge. Then how do you put that in a hashtag? And then artistic epistemology, but that's not very friendly as a hashtag. You can think of artistic practice in relation to other disciplines. But again, I don't want to resist your question too much, and I'm trying to develop something on what you're proposing, but I do find it hard to reduce it to short words. But in general, like if you want to, let's say, expand the hashtag proposal to maybe wider concepts, I'd say these are maybe the important elements. The specificity of different artistic practices and methodologies, the way these can produce forms of knowledge, the relationship between these forms of knowledge with knowledge that is produced in other disciplines, a resistance to illustration, in the sense that I find it very important that artistic research or the knowledge produced through artistic research doesn't illustrate concepts or results from other disciplines, and you have a genuine interdisciplinary approach. Yeah, maybe I'll stop here.
Obviously, the resistance is also productive, so thank you for that. Are there any interesting trends or trajectories in artistic research as of now that you see related to those, I guess, three categories you've just mentioned? And please, you can obviously be specific if you want, either related to your own artistic research practice or somebody else's.
At the moment, all trends are interesting in the sense that the most interesting is the actual period that we are in. And I think it's much more productive than it was maybe 10 years ago, which is when I first started thinking about getting involved in an artistic research type of project and maybe starting a PhD. Because obviously it's a new field. It's a recent field in this sense of it being embedded in the academy. Artists have always done research. This is not new. But in this sense of trying to find a coexistence, a way to live together within academic context, that's relatively new. So I think what happened in the last 10 years, and there are definitely discussions around it, also in conferences, if we think of, the post-research condition, which happened at the University of Utrecht in 2021, farewell to research that happened in Bucharest, both initiated by Henk Slager. There is an attempt in the field to question what happened in the last years and to draw some conclusions. And I think what's very interesting to me is that several directions have been tried out. Very interesting projects have come out of each of them. There are already a lot of discussions around the models, the continental model, which maybe tries to propose another methodology, or the UK model, which is supposed to be closer to the sciences and has this hypothesis-based type of research, the Scandinavian model. So there are different ways of defining structures, which also, of course, depend on the restrictions of each university. But I think from each of these models, very interesting projects emerged. There are artists who decided to follow a fully theoretical approach, almost an art historical approach. and then have that as a complement to their own practice. I'm thinking of an artist like Neil Clements, for example, in Glasgow. And his approach was strictly art historical, and he's studying formalism in British art in the 60s. But then that fully informs his own practice. And then at the other end, you have approaches which go for a very experimental form. And I'm thinking of somebody like Sarah Jones, for example, who finished a PhD at the University of Sydney, studying actually Czechoslovak artist Stano Filko in relation to the philosophy of Albert North Whitehead. But the form is a very experimental essay. So then the content informs the thesis, but then the thesis itself in the type of writing moves away from a classic academic format, and then that's where the experiment happens. To go back to your question, I think it's an interesting moment in which all these directions, be it more academic, being less academic and maybe more focused on the specificity of practice, each of these models has produced very interesting results. And now you have a lot of combinations as well. Because you asked of my own research, one issue I had, for example, was the fact that I couldn't define what I did specifically as practice-based or practice-led research. In the definition that was offered by Sarah Rubich, a practice-based research is one which starts from a hypothesis and from a certain question and theory, and then the practice is maybe more illustrative of that theory. And then a practice-led approach is one which is based on intuition, on an artistic practice in the studio, which follows its own rhythm, but is maybe not so systematic. But then in my case, I felt that I started from a theoretical question because I was interested in questions posed by realism in philosophy and the philosophy of science, in the contradictions posed by so-called unobservable objects in science, by something which resists experiments and measurements, entities which pose a problem to science. But then in asking how such a hypothetical object, more on the border of science fiction, can be productive for artistic practice, illustration is not really useful anymore, because you have to find other ways of going around that. You have to find a particular methodology. For me, this concept of estrangement was central. Like this was my own research. In the end, other methods developed out of that initial contradiction. So I think the hybrids that are starting to appear between the different models that have already been defined are actually quite productive. And as I was saying at the beginning, the individual artistic practices and how these particular methodologies appear, which are maybe surprising combinations between different techniques,
Would it be too much to say then that the artistic research kind of also fills the epistemological gap of traditional scientific research?
It definitely fills a certain epistemological gap, but the question is which one. That was an issue for me, definitely, and I think maybe other interdisciplinary projects which actually involve researchers from the sciences can answer that question better. In my case, what I realized in the process is that I could not, in my own project, answer the question of a gap in science or a gap in philosophy. So my aim was not to answer a gap in another discipline. What I tried to do in the end was to maybe ask similar questions, but try to only work on a gap in the field of art, so to say. It's difficult to aim to fill a gap in another discipline because every discipline has its own history. And one perspective that was very useful for me, that I find very interesting for artistic research in general, but also for any idea of interdisciplinarity, is the proposal of French philosopher Anne-Françoise Schmitt, who writes about interdisciplinarity. But what she proposes is an interdisciplinarity where the disciplines don't fully know each other perfectly. So the dialogue operates through fragments, but you cannot apply a discipline fully to another discipline. The transfer is not straightforward. What's most interesting for me, and how I think artistic research responds to the gap more accurately, is maybe even a gap between disciplines, as opposed to aiming to fill a gap in another discipline, which is maybe not fully known. In the transfer between disciplines, there are always gaps. Some of those questions that I mentioned in philosophy, in the philosophy of science, were interesting and productive, but then when the same people were trying to answer those questions in art, that's where the gaps appeared. This is maybe one of the really interesting challenges of artistic research, that you have practitioners, you have artists who suddenly get involved in this discursive space around their work, also in an academic context, and can reclaim some of this discursive space from theoretical disciplines. Because, of course, historically you had this division where the artist is the one who makes things, and then the theorist comes and interprets the things that the artist has made, or interprets the field as a whole, be it in a general sense. It can be a critic, it can be a theorist, or it can be a historian, it can be a philosopher. We have the famous examples of philosophers writing about contemporary art. That's where a lot of gaps appear. So I think that's, for me, the very interesting contribution that the field of artistic research can bring, despite its difficulties. It can really bring this complementary voice of the artists to a discursive space around the artistic work and what the field does in a more general sense. Sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, but it's always present.
To get to the specificities, what would be the approach, or maybe even the vision, you are bringing to L'Art and the Academy?
Definitely elements of what I already mentioned will play a part. I must say I was already very inspired by the proposal that the L'Art project already made before even I applied to be part of it, which is a context for artistic research which has at its center the specificity of artistic practice, the methods of practice-led research, one which tries to find ways for a community of researchers, of artist researchers, to develop their own work and also do something together or have some exchanges. So that starting point was something that I'm particularly very interested in. And as I said earlier, I would like to imagine a space where individual artistic research projects are possible without the danger of illustration or without a relationship to another discipline in which there is a hierarchy. This is a difficult aim. How can you have an interdisciplinary dialogue in which artistic practice is an equal, shall we say, partner in a conversation, and it doesn't just maybe use knowledge from other disciplines to illustrate them in practice? This is one element. Of course, in order to do that, I think it's important to have a space which allows for different approaches, for different practices, for different practitioners to develop a research that makes sense for their own practice. I wouldn't emphasize a common theme. I wouldn't emphasize a common background of references, a theoretical context that brings together everybody. I would imagine a place where individual artistic research projects are the starting point. And then a structure is possible for these projects to develop, but also for a community to have an exchange. Maybe the last element I would mention would be, because of my own background and because of the role performance has in my own work, which is not the only medium I use, obviously, but it's present in most of my projects. I can imagine this idea of not so much performance as an artistic medium, but maybe a performative approach to presentations, to spaces of gathering, could be an element that is maybe useful in order to think of formats in which different research practices can come together and then also can be shown. Because that's a question. How to share some of the, let's say, in classical artistic research terms, how to share the results of the research in a form that's maybe not the same as an academic form.
Are there any specificities of doing this kind of either institutional space or maybe even like artistic research as a practice generally in our Eastern European art social context?
There is something there, definitely, in the particular way of constructing art universities in Central and Eastern Europe. There is definitely a more traditional approach to disciplines. There is a coexistence of art history and practice, shall we say, disciplines, studio disciplines. And as a result, closer connection to the history of art in a wider sense and to very old practices. I don't know, you can maybe contradict me in terms of what happens in Prague, but in terms of Bucharest and other universities I've been in, you can't go through an art university without becoming familiar with art history, not only in the sense of 20th century art. While that focus on specific disciplines, which is still prevalent in many departments, not all of them, but in many departments, and this focus on art history before the 20th century can be frustrating, and definitely has been frustrating for me when I was studying. If you're looking towards contemporary art and would like to be engaged exclusively in contemporary art discourses and contemporary art practices and 20th century art types of working and 20th century art examples, in the long run, I think this familiarity with the whole history of art and the different approaches of each medium can be a very, very useful background in the sense of what I was describing earlier of the history of a discipline that one must be aware of in order to have a proper interdisciplinary debate. It's a history that cannot be so easily discarded or dismissed. So I think that coexistence in the long run can provide something very interesting. That was my experience, at least. But it did take a while. When you're out of the university, give it 5 years, give it 10 years, all the other things that you're actually maybe not so involved in start to come true in your own work, start to come true in other artists' work from your generation, practices that wouldn't be possible without that background. You have artists who only worked in mixed media, new media, video, and then suddenly they make a series of paintings and they're beautiful. And that just would not be possible. Or you have an exhibition curated by a curator who studied art history in one of these departments. I'm thinking, for example, of somebody like Mihnea Mircan, who curated the biennial in Timișoara, starting from a painting by Parmigianino. This is not possible if the education system only focuses on contemporary art discourses, 20th century art. And I think while the imbalance sometimes between 20th century examples and pre-20th century 20th century art and art history can be frustrating when you're studying, you can see the results later in everybody's practice. I would focus on the positive consequences of this, because what doesn't work with it we know, but what works is not discussed as often.
I mean, thank you. I'm sure that's very motivating also for the bachelor and master's degrees art students at the academy as well. And I really mean it. I have the last question now, I guess. If I imagine master's student at the academy, perhaps somebody in the sculpture studio who's maybe also making stuff that's informed by theory or wider social and cultural context, why should they consider studying an artistic research PhD? I know you haven't started yet, but please feel free to speculate. I'm assuming they're making a more traditional object-based practice.
Generally, the biggest issue, for me at least, or from my perspective, in terms of artistic research, is not so much whether a practitioner or an artist is interested in text, or is interested in theory, or is interested even in theory from other fields. I think it's more a question of whether a practitioner sees their work or the work they're doing in that particular moment as something which develops over a longer period of time with a coherence, with an internal coherence, and maybe with a clear relationship to a context. Be it the context of their own artistic medium, shall we say, you mentioned sculpture, shall we say sculpture, or it can also be the context of a medium that has a presence also outside of the arts. You're talking about video games earlier. If you're working with a new technology, shall we say, and that technology has a context outside of the arts, and that's maybe the context in which that practitioner's work finds itself. I think the most important question is not so much the relationship to text, and definitely not the relationship to text from other disciplines. So I wouldn't see that as the starting point, because that doesn't have to be present. I think the most important thing is a critical relationship to one's own practice and perspective on the practice as a longer term project, or at least on the practice in that particular period. Because it has to be something that develops over a number of years, that remains coherent within that period, that asks certain questions about the practice, and that asks those questions in relation to a wider context. And that context can be the context of other disciplines, as we spoke at the beginning, but it can also be the context of your own medium, or it can also be the context, a certain artistic context that your practice is part of. But you need to have that type of critical relationship to that context. You need to have some questions that are hopefully going to be answered in the process. And those questions are not necessarily, questions on a piece of paper that are answered in words. Sometimes it can be a relationship between language and the practice, and it needs to be a coherent, longer-term project. Then exactly how these elements find their specific manifestation in an artistic research project, it depends on the practice. It could be a relationship with other disciplines. It could be with theories from other disciplines. It could be a relationship just within art and art discourses and contemporary art theory. It can be a relationship to, as I said, a medium that's both used in the arts and outside of the arts, and then that becomes the relationship. And all these things are also a bit discovered in the process. Like, you don't always know initially what you're going to use. Like in my case, I thought a lot of the references I started from were not so useful in the process. And I had to find other things. I was exactly what you're describing, I started as that type of artist who is making some works. I was making performances mainly at the time. And I was interested in theories from another field, particular discussions within contemporary philosophy. And I found them interesting, and I wanted to see what this relationship produces. But what I discovered is that actually I need other references to fill the gaps I had. I needed to ask other questions and find other sources to answer the question. So you mightn't know from the beginning what you need. Yeah, the premise would be more a long-term coherent practice, or what you see as developing into a long-term coherent project, which has a relationship to a wider context that's not only based on your work. That's for me the starting point. And of course, you might have to write a bit. That's also... But how much and what about exactly, that's something that can be discussed in the process and is always in a relationship to the practice.
What about the personal level, on the level of emotions, motivations, transformative shifts in your own view onto your own practice? I mean, there must be some, effective side to making this jump from making an object-based practice or doing object-based practice to an artistic research practice.
I would say a few things to that. The first one is, I don't think it's a good idea to jump from studying to studying again. So I think there needs to be a long enough period after finishing studying, after a BA, after an MA, where the practice can develop. So then you need to be quite aware of how you work, what type of work you make, how does the work develop, what are the stages in the work, how often do they change, how likely is it that in 4 years' time you'll still be working on something that's connected to what you're doing now. Is what you're doing now still one way or another related to what you're doing 4 years ago? Can you think of that process as a coherent process or not? I would suggest about 10 years, but, maybe a bit less, definitely not 3, So you need enough time for the practice to develop, so you're aware of the rhythm in which it's developing, and then you can anticipate whether in 4 years' time you'd still be interested in the topic you proposed, because you have to be at least interested in it, if not as excited as you were when you started 4 years later. It needs to be long-term. It needs to still have a life in it 4 or 5 years later.
Thank you so much. Have a nice rest of a day and holidays and all, and thanks so much.
Great holidays, and thank you.
Thank you for listening to the second part of Research with Art podcast. If you haven't, listen to the first installment that is hovering somewhere around here. In it, you'll find 3 interviews and 4 perspectives on what the terrain of artistic research looks like today, its role in reflecting both on art and science, as well as what pleasure, non-human world, and digging in the dirt have to do with it. I am Ondřej Trhoň, and this podcast was created with the support of a grant from the National Recovery Plan awarded to the Academy of Fine Arts by the Ministry of Culture of the Czech Republic in 2023.